Hello everyone, today's video is on Clayton Lockett. He was executed on April 29, 2014 in the state of Oklahoma. Clayton Lockett was born on the fateful day of November 22, 1975. His parents' tumultuous relationship could not weather the difficulties of pregnancy, and by the time his mother entered her third trimester, they had long since parted ways. His mother's heavy reliance on illicit substances during her pregnancy meant that Clayton came into this world in an especially fragile state. The exact location of his birth remains unknown, but it is a fact that his mother did just enough to, and I say this loosely, take care of him until he was 3 years old. One day in 1978, with no warning, she took him to his father's doorstep, nestled in a basket, and said her final goodbyes. Given his age, Clayton was understandably confused and distraught, coping alone with the traumatic separation from his mother while attempting to adjust to life with a man he barely knew. Clayton's father, Mr. Lockett, discovered Clayton at his doorstep in a urine-soaked diaper. Mr. Lockett was not met with joy when he laid eyes on Clayton. Unfortunately for Clayton, it seemed as though his saving grace would never come. Instead of solace and security within his new home, he was met with emotions so volatile they birthed physical violence. Belts and boards were used on him whenever his father felt provoked. Sometimes, things even escalated to the point where death threats were made using Mr. Lockett's firearm. Many family members witnessed the heinous acts against Clayton, yet chose to remain silent. I would like to pause the video for a minute and ask you guys a question. If you knew your brother, mother, or father treated a younger family member like Clayton's father treated him, would you keep it in the family and give chances, remove the younger family out of that person's home, or would you ignore it and live your own life? You would think many years had passed, but in 1978, the same year he was left on his father's doorstep, Clayton was also introduced to explicit and inappropriate movies. Along with the adult films, Mr. Lockett also forced Clayton to use illegal substances. Clayton grew a dependence very young, and his drug use was something he could not control when the person in charge of his safety and well-being was doing it themselves and forcing it on him as well. As Clayton got older, Mr. Lockett would teach him that women were no good. Clayton grew a disdain for women and believed they deserved no respect. Mr. Lockett would tell Clayton that women were only good for one thing. Maybe a video or two was popped in that Clayton would be forced to watch, and the actions performed in the adult videos were the actions Mr. Lockett said women were good for. He would also teach Clayton that women only existed to do what men wanted them to do or for what men needed. The family had long suspected that Clayton's older brother was sexually assaulting him, yet they chose to do nothing to protect him. It became clear that this trauma had taken its toll on Clayton. He developed an incessant thumb-sucking habit and wet the bed until he was 12 years old. To make matters worse, a bad fall left him with a concussion. Instead of helping Clayton find his way back to stability, mentally and emotionally unstable Mr. Lockett took advantage and taught him how to steal, leading to Clayton becoming his father's pawn. He would force Clayton to commit petty crimes. By the time Clayton turned 16, he had already made a name for himself in the streets, and in May of 1992, he was busted on burglary charges in Kay County. In November of 1992, a few days before his 17th birthday, he was convicted and found guilty for a slew of charges: unauthorized use of a motor vehicle and knowingly concealing stolen property, to name a couple. Clayton was tried, and a judge sentenced him to 7 years at an adult prison despite his age. The judge took into consideration the fact that earlier that year, Clayton pleaded no contest to 2 counts of intimidating state witnesses. Clayton was then transferred to the Oklahoma State Prison. Despite growing up tough and around violence, the fact of the matter was that Clayton was only 16, and he was surrounded by men who were much bigger and more experienced criminals. One day while locked up, 3 grown prisoners surrounded him, each taking their turn in pinning him down and sexually assaulting him with no one around to help. Each man had their minutes with Clayton, and there was no guard in sight. It wasn't until after the assaults were complete that Clayton received the assistance he needed. Clayton was released early on probation, but he could not stay on the straight path. In August of 1996, he was sentenced to 4 years in prison for 3 counts of conspiracy to commit a felony over in Grady County. For these crimes, Clayton was once again released early. Choosing not to make good choices and turn his life around, he went back to his rough and tough gang mentality. It was a fairly warm night on June 3rd, 1999 in Perry, Oklahoma. It was about 10:30 in the evening, and a man by the name of Bobby Bornt fell asleep on his living room couch. Suddenly, a loud bang woke him out of his sleep. Clayton, his 27-year-old friend Sean Mathis, and his 19-year-old cousin Alfonso Lockett kicked down Bobby's front door and immediately began assaulting him. Clayton was equipped with a shotgun, and the other men were equipped with material and items strong enough to restrain Bobby. After restraining Bobby, the men began tearing the house up looking for drugs. It turned out that the men knew Bobby, and Clayton was upset with Bobby for an unpaid marijuana and tattoo debt. As the trio looked around for drugs and money, two women ended up arriving at Bobby's house: Summer Bradshaw and 19-year-old Stephanie Neiman. Stephanie Neiman was a high school graduate who had just been gifted a brand new Chevy truck by her parents. She loved the cartoon character Tasmanian Devil, so her truck sported a Tasmanian Devil sticker and her license plate was changed to Taz. On this particular evening, Stephanie and Summer decided to stop by Bobby's house unannounced so they could hang out. The two women had no idea what was taking place in Bobby's home. Stephanie waited in the car while Summer walked towards the front door to see if Bobby was home. When the men heard Summer asking to be let in, they pulled her inside, assaulted her, and pushed her face against the wall. They then requested she yell out for her friend Stephanie to come inside of the house. Stephanie, not realizing that danger was awaiting her inside of the house, casually walked inside. Stephanie was assaulted as soon as she stepped foot in the house. The men took the keys to her pickup truck, and then both women were restrained just like Bobby was, but they were made to stay inside one of the bedrooms while Bobby was in the living room. It was in this bedroom that the men saw Bobby's son Sam fast asleep in his crib. Sam was brought into this world in September of 1998. The men did not harm Sam, but instead of continuing to look for drugs, Clayton, Alfonso, and Sean took turns sexually assaulting Summer. After assaulting Summer, the trio decided to put Summer and Stephanie in the pickup truck they arrived in. Bobby and Sam were placed in Bobby's truck. They were loaded in the back of their pickup trucks and driven to a remote rural location. When they arrived at this remote location, Summer was sexually assaulted for the second time by Clayton and Mathis. Summer lay defenseless in a ditch, and she refused to fight because the men told her, "In order for you to live, this is what you've got to do." After the men were done taking their turn with Summer, Clayton ordered Sean to dig a grave. As Sean was digging, he told him, "Someone has got to go." Sean took some time digging a grave, but when he was finished, Stephanie was brought to the hole first. Stephanie remained strong despite being in extreme fear. She had to watch Sean dig her grave for nearly 20 minutes. She said out loud, "Oh God, please, please." The men asked her to promise she would not go to authorities to rat on them, but she refused to promise the men anything. Angered by her refusal to make a promise, Clayton shot her with his shotgun. He attempted to shoot her again, but his gun jammed. He spent some time fixing it, and when he was successful in fixing it, he shot Stephanie again. Clayton ordered Sean to place Stephanie's body in the grave, but Sean expressed to him that Stephanie was still alive. Clayton did not care and again demanded Sean bury Stephanie's body. Sean took Stephanie's body, placed her in the hole, and began to cover her with dirt. While Sean was burying Stephanie, Clayton warned Bobby and Summer that if they told anyone about what they had done, they would be killed too. Deciding to keep the remaining victims alive, the men drove the trucks back to Bobby's house. Bobby, Sam, and Summer were dropped off, and then the trio took off in Bobby's pickup truck. The men truly believed that the witnesses would keep their promise about not telling authorities about their sexual assaults and the fact that they buried Stephanie while she was still fighting for her life. The very next day on June 4th, 1999, Bobby and Summer went to the Perry Police Department and told authorities everything. They also told authorities that the only reason they think they survived was because the killers knew they had children and Stephanie had no children. Police spent hours searching for Stephanie, but they were unsuccessful. Authorities eventually ended up finding Clayton, Sean, and Alfonso at Sean's house, and they were all arrested and brought in for questioning. Clayton admitted to his crimes against Summer and Stephanie, and he led police to where her body was buried. With full confessions, all three men were indicted on murder charges. Clayton was charged with conspiracy, first-degree burglary, assault with a deadly weapon, multiple accounts of sexual assault, robbery by force, and more. The state was seeking the death penalty because of the aggravating factors, and they also took into account that Clayton was a previously convicted felon. The court said that the murder he committed against Stephanie was committed for the purpose of avoiding or preventing a lawful arrest or prosecution. The court also believed that there was a probability that Clayton would commit acts of violence that would constitute a continuing threat to society. During trial, the court portrayed Clayton as the mastermind because he was the one who kicked Bobby's door down, he was seen carrying the shotgun, and Bobby testified in court that Clayton was the one giving orders. Clayton's attorneys wanted to present the possibility of an insanity defense, so Clayton was examined by mental health professionals. The defense brought Dr. John R. Smith to the stand to testify about Clayton's well-being. He claimed that although Clayton was not insane, he did have a severe psychotic disorder, or he suffered from dissociative identity disorder. He claimed that Clayton was indeed mentally ill. Dr. Smith also testified that he could not say with any degree of certainty whether Clayton would or would not be violent in a prison setting, but he did feel certain that Clayton would protect his territory. The state then brought forth their mental health expert by the name of Dr. John Call. Dr. Call performed a forensic psychological evaluation based on multiple sources. He tried to evaluate Clayton, but because he was working for the state, Clayton refused to cooperate. He testified that based on his review of all sources, Clayton was not insane, mentally ill, or suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. Instead, he believed Clayton had an antisocial personality disorder and was a psychopath. Clayton was found guilty in August of 2000 of first-degree murder and 18 other counts a year after killing 19-year-old Stephanie Neiman. Clayton was 24 years old. In a victim's impact statement given by Stephanie's parents, Steve and Susie Neiman, they told jurors, "Right is right and wrong is wrong." Maybe that's what Clayton was so scared of, because Stephanie did stand up for her rights. She did not blink an eye at him. We raised her to work hard for what she's got. Steve and Susie asked jurors to give Clayton Lockett the death penalty for taking the life of their only child, who had graduated from Perry High School 2 weeks before her death. When it was time for sentencing, the jurors recommended Clayton be sentenced to death, and the judge presiding over the case agreed with the jury's recommendation. Over the years, there were appeals, but all of his appeals were denied. Some appeals were how it was unfair to show the court images of his victim, or how the death sentence was unconstitutional. After many failed appeals, in 2014, when it was nearing Clayton's execution date, his lawyers were finally successful in getting a stay of execution. It was March 26, 2014, when a trial judge agreed with lawyers when they claimed the death sentence was unconstitutional and that it was unconstitutional for Clayton to know exactly how he would be killed. The case was then transferred to the Oklahoma Supreme Court, but they only review civil cases and hold no legal authority to stay an execution, even if the manner of that execution is under attack in the civil courts. The Supreme Court then transferred Clayton's request for a stay of execution to the Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals. Even though the Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals does possess the legal authority to stay an execution, on April 18, 2014, they refused to consider the stay, claiming they had a lack of jurisdiction. On April 21st, the case was transferred back to the Supreme Court, and they publicly admitted to being hesitant about making a decision, but they ultimately stayed Clayton's execution, but they also stated that they were still reviewing his civil law claims. The very next day, on April 22nd, Governor Fallin entered her own stay of execution for Clayton, but not because she wanted to save Clayton. She only did it to override the Supreme Court stay of execution. On April 23rd, the Supreme Court dissolved their stay of execution, and they also denied Clayton's civil law claims. On April 29th, Governor Fallin ordered that Clayton's execution be scheduled for April 30th, 2014 in McAlester, Oklahoma. Clayton was scheduled to die by method of lethal injection, but the chemical cocktail used for his upcoming execution had not been used yet. A spokesperson said that Florida used a similar 3-drug concoction, but Florida's dosage of midazolam was 5 times greater than what it would be in Oklahoma, where Clayton was to be executed. The prison spokesperson, Jerry Massey, spoke to the media and said that Clayton's execution will likely take longer than normal because the first drug is expected to work more slowly. "Don't be surprised," he said. Before Clayton's execution, he was awarded a last meal but was not allowed to go over his $15 limit. Clayton decided to order Chateaubriand. This particular steak went over his limit, so the prison offered him steak from a local restaurant called Western Sizzling, but Clayton refused. In the end, Clayton did not have a last meal. 38-year-old Clayton was finally set to die. Before the execution, family of Clayton's victim Stephanie released a statement. God blessed us with our precious daughter Stephanie for 19 years. Stephanie loved children. She worked in a vacation Bible school and always helped with our church nativity scenes. She was the joy of our life. We are thankful this day has finally arrived and justice will be served. It was now April 30th, 2014, and Clayton was escorted to the execution chamber. He was strapped into the bed and was asked if he had any last words, and he replied by saying no. When the execution began, the phlebotomist was unable to find a good location to place the IVs. The phlebotomist tried Clayton's arms, both of his legs, and his feet. Finally, the IV line was placed in Clayton's groin area. It was 6:18 p.m. when the lethal injection IV lines were inserted in the groin. 5 minutes later, at 6:23 p.m., the first drug was administered. The first drug was necessary to cause loss of consciousness. At 6:33 p.m., Clayton was finally declared unconscious, and the final 2 drugs were administered. One drug was used to stop Clayton's heart. Almost another 10 minutes after the last 2 drugs were administered, the shades were lowered to block witnesses from seeing Clayton. Doctors reported that a vein collapsed and drugs either absorbed into the tissue, leaked out, or both. Doctors then reported that not enough drugs were administered to cause death, and there was no other vein available to go on with the execution, and even if there were available veins, there weren't enough drugs left to be administered to complete the execution. With that being said, Clayton still had a faint heartbeat, but they had not yet pulled the plug on the execution. Although witnesses believed Clayton was pronounced dead, the execution team was still figuring out what to do because Clayton was still alive. The execution was temporarily halted, but the execution team never had to come up with a different solution because Clayton ended up dying from a heart attack 43 minutes after the first drug was administered. Clayton's attorney said that what the prison did was unjust and cruel because it took him so long to die, and he was in pain for nearly an hour before being pronounced dead. His attorneys also expressed that they did figure there were complications happening with the execution, but they thought the executioners would revive Clayton because he was not dying from the drugs. One attorney by the name of David Autry said, "This was obviously a botched execution. I was thinking that Mr. Lockett was not fully sedated and that he was experiencing a great deal of pain. For them to claim that he was sedated appropriately and adequately is ridiculous. It was extremely distressing to watch, let alone go through like Mr. Lockett did." Clayton's mother, LaDonna Hollins, said that even though she felt for Clayton's victim Stephanie Neiman and Stephanie's mother, she wanted justice for her son. She wanted the state to investigate her son's death. She was quoted saying, "He was in pain, and in our Constitution it clearly states that we should not make a man suffer like this, so I'm torn. My heart aches that he had to suffer like that. Stephanie suffered, I'm sure, but now here's the end result. They are both dead now. She's not any more alive than she was the day before. My heart bleeds as well as Mrs. Neiman's heart bleeds. The reason for the drugs was to kill him, not to make him suffer like that. I have faith that through my son's death that we can change a wrong that needs to be changed." Governor Mary Fallin issued a statement shortly after Clayton's death. She issued an executive order to halt the execution of the next inmate that was scheduled to be executed because of the complications that occurred with Clayton, and that inmate scheduled to die was Charles Warner. "I have asked the Department of Corrections to conduct a full review of Oklahoma's execution procedures to determine what happened and why during this evening's execution of Clayton Darrell Lockett. I have issued an executive order delaying the execution of Charles Frederick Warner for 14 days to allow for that review to be completed." No one truly believed the state would conduct an investigation within 2 weeks. One spokesperson said, "I assumed that they were going to try to revive him. What efforts, if any, they made to revive him or to try to counteract the drugs, I don't know." The state's pledge to investigate the botched execution in 2 weeks before Warner's execution is not going to cut it. They're going down the same path they've gone down before, trying to get this done at all costs regardless. That's going to be a whitewash. They're going to paper over this. Charles Warner was not executed until the following year, and Oklahoma continues to carry out executions by method of lethal injection. As for Clayton, he was buried in the prison cemetery. Thank you all for watching another episode of Death Row Executions. Let me know what you guys think of this story in the comments below.